Commentary of I think, therefore I exist.
It's been almost 400 years since the medieval French philosopher Descartes spoke. It is only a matter of controversy all over the world. I think, therefore I exist. What does that mean, I think, therefore I exist? First, there are many questions that must be answered in order to find oneself and things that are one's own. The first question to be answered is, what does actually exist and what does not actually exist in this world?
What does exist and amp? What does not exist?
I think, therefore I exist, is the conclusion of this question. So how did I think, therefore I exist, come out from, what does actually exist and what does not actually exist in this world?
The process of resolving the question, what actually exists in this world, and what does not actually exist in this world, is very long and complex. There are so many big and small conclusions on the way. Moreover, I cannot introduce all the conclusions because the expression is very different for each person. So please understand that I will focus on some major conclusions.
Consider person who think, what does actually exist and what does not actually exist in this world?
What does exists? And what does not exists?
Get the conclusion, what is visible does exist, but what is invisible does not exist most often at first. This conclusion means that person distinguish on the basis of I do, what does exist and what does not exist at first.
Only visible things does exist but invisible things does not exist.
More precisely, person think there is nothing that cannot be recognized through five senses because one can only identify the presence of what they can perceive as the five senses of sight, hearing, and olfactory at the earliest. But after a while, person realize that like a mirage that one can see in the desert, there are many things in this world that are visible but does not actually exist. And there are many things in this world that are invisible but does actually exist like thought. This is called discovery of exceptions. Through these many discovery of exceptions, person will know that visible things are divided into real image that actually exists and virtual image that does not actually exist. Invisible things are divided into real image that does actually exist and virtual image that does not actually exist too. After that, as person continue to discover more exceptions, B realizes that eyes, five senses cannot enough to be a criterion for distinguishing between what does actually exist and what does not actually exist. So person fixed the first conclusion.
Cannot say that visible thing does necessarily exist, an invisible thing does not necessarily exist.
More precisely, cannot say that what can be recognized through five senses does necessarily exist, and what cannot recognize through five senses does not necessarily exist. After that, who continuing to search for what actually exists and what does not actually exist, will know the facts one by one. That there are many, what does not actually exist among known to, what does exist, and what does actually exist among known to, what does not exist.
Often people say this does exist and amp. That does not exist but there are many, what does not exist among, what people say does exist and what does exist among, what people say does not exist.
This time, person get to know the fact that there are many inaccurate information among the things he has ever known, such as knowledge learned through books. So person gradually realize that informations cannot be a standard to distinguish what does exist and what does not exist. For this reason person revises the previous conclusion again.
What does exist does not exist, and amp. What does not exist does exist.
After that, the person who continued to look for what does exist and what does not exist becomes increasingly aware that one cannot know all what does exist and what does not exist in this world by one's ability.
There are too much things that cannot know whether it exists or does not exist in this world. I cannot know all of what does actually exist and amp. What actually does not exist in this world because there is a limit to human ability.
For this reason, person revised the previous conclusion once again.
although cannot know all of what does actually exist and what actually does not exist in this world. But one clear fact is that what does exist and what does not exist.
From this moment, person becoming increasingly unsure of the presence of visible objects, so person begins to doubt the existence of everything that is visible.
Does that cars actually exist? Or does not actually exist? Does that buildings actually exist? Or does not actually exist?
This is the content that Descartes said he doubted the existence of all things. These doubts are increasingly transferred to people. Subsequently, person begins to suspect even the existence of his parents more and more. Then person starts to doubt even one's own existence.
Do I actually exist? Or am I only one a virtual image that does not actually exist?
Therefore the person becomes more and more confused.
I may be a virtual image mirror that does not actually exist.
Meanwhile, person begins to look for standards that can clearly divide what does actually exist and what does not actually exist in this world.
What conditions need do things have in order to exist in this world?
After many days of trial and error, person come to the conclusion that to actually exist in this world it must have the ability to think or think. Sooner or later, person who is in a state of tremendous confusion to doubt one's own existence realizes that oneself continues to think.
I have the ability to think, and I'm actually thinking.
Like this, person confirmed the fact oneself actually exists in this world by oneself thinking finding.
If so, then I certainly exist in this world. Yes, I think, therefore I exist. I am certainly not a virtual image like a mirage, but a real image that actually exists in this world.
As described above, I think, therefore I exist. Means to exist in this world it must have the ability to think, I have that ability and am. I actually think, so I actually exist in this world. This is the approximate process from the conclusion of what is visible does exist, but what is invisible does not exist to I think, therefore I exist, to this point. So it is correct to say that I think, therefore I exist, is not a Descartes words but a conclusion of what actually exists and am. What does not actually exist in this world. Moreover, there were several people among famous people who had reached the I think, therefore I exist before Descartes. In addition, there are many people today who came to the same conclusion as Descartes in search of what actually exists and am. What does not actually exist. Moreover, cannot be said that I think, therefore I exist is Descartes' word. As I mentioned, I think, therefore I exist is not the final conclusion of the question, what actually exists in this world, and am. What does not actually exist in this world. Because there are so much things in this world that have not ability of think, such as stone and iron. So, one soon finds out that I think, therefore I exist also has so many exceptions. So persons start trying again, to find a more complete conclusion. Through such a long process, the criterion of the person who distinguishes what does actually exist and what does not actually exist changes gradually from concrete standards such as I to metaphysical standards such as thought. Finally, there are a lot of people in this world who want to know oneself. But only some of them really try to know oneself. And only some of them think about what actually exists and am. What does not actually exist in this world. Only a few of these people realize that I think, therefore I exist. So, in fact, it is very rare for someone who realizes I think, therefore I exist. But even if continue to look for one's own, if try to know oneself, anyone finally realize I think, therefore I exist. Like this, everyone's thoughts eventually converge to I think, therefore I exist. Therefore, it is correct to understand that the idea of everyone who did not realize I think, therefore I exist, including nearly all philosophies of the East and am. The West is a part of I think, therefore I exist.
Although it is too old to remember correctly, anyway I was looking for only my own from 19 years old. Then one day in the early 20s I began to search for what actually exists and what does not actually exist in this world. One day after that, about a year and a half to 2 years later, I realized, I think, therefore I exists. Like Descartes. After that, I met several people who also realized I think, therefore I exists. For decades. The text here is a record that people who have realized it, including myself, have come to realize it.